you have to understand that it's not just about the functional aspect, but, it impacts someone's sense of self and who they are as a person. And, it can certainly weigh on someone after a while. Like, especially if you've had all these repeated challenges of, not doing well with things because of these issues. And so by unpacking that, through therapy, that's a really good starting point to then figure out how do you make it better? Because there's obviously lots of practical strategies you can do, but you also have to address the psychological piece as well. It's not just about, simple strategies like calendar or task list or writing stuff down. You have to also address the psychological piece too.
MindHack is a podcast about the psychology behind performance, behavior change, and self-optimization. Each episode explores how to think clearly, work smarter, and live intentionally through insightful conversations with leading entrepreneurs, scientists, and experts in human behavior. Hello, and welcome to the MindHack podcast, the show where we explore performance, mindset, and personal growth. I'm your host, Cody McLean, and today we're talking about the gap between knowing what to do and actually doing it. If you juggle big goals and still find yourself stuck on small starts, this episode will feel like a reset. Our guest today is Dr. Carey Heller, a licensed psychologist in Maryland and Washington, D.C. He is also the founder of the Heller Psychology Group and serves as the chair of the editorial advisory board for CHAD, which is largely considered to be one of the nation's leading nonprofit groups dedicated to improving the lives of millions of Americans living with ADHD. In this episode, we'll unpack how to spot executive dysfunction early and install the right systems so focus, follow through, and calm become repeatable habits. If you've ever stared at your task list and felt your brain slide off the page, you're in the right place. So please welcome Dr. Carey Heller. Dr. Heller, welcome to the show.
Thanks a lot. Appreciate you having me here. I'm excited to chat about all this today.
Yeah, and so executive dysfunction is something that I think everybody has to some extent and kind of on a spectrum to some extent. And obviously those with ADHD probably have it worse. And so I would love to really understand what executive dysfunction is and kind of what is it when someone comes to you feeling like they're stuck, kind of how do you map out dysfunction and kind of where do you start exactly?
Sure. So executive function challenges, or, people also refer to as executive dysfunction, is the idea that you have a hard time with, basically executive function is an umbrella term. So it represents planning, organizing, task initiation, basically the things you would use to solve a task or complete a problem or do something. Like basically you need them pretty much to really do anything in life. But part of the issue with it is that as far as like how to, like if someone's coming to you and we're trying to figure out what's going on, I need to better understand what's actually causing the executive function issues. Because there's many, so certainly ADHD is definitely a very common cause for executive function issues, but it's not the only cause. If someone's anxious or nervous, they may have a hard time focusing, and in turn, then may have a hard time getting started. They may, worry about having, this needs to be perfect, and so they can't start. You could have someone who's really depressed, and so they have a hard time getting themselves to do things because they're depressed. You could have someone that has OCD and has a hard time, shifting attention and then getting stuff done because of all the other stuff going on in their head. So the point is almost any mental health disorder can have an impact to executive functioning. Other things also, lack of sleep. So the point is that in order, like the first step in trying to figure out how to make it better is to try to better understand what's actually causing the issues with executive functioning in the first place.
And so we've all heard stories of, say, adults who go from school into middle age and then find out all of a sudden that they have ADHD. And maybe they get on medication, maybe it changes their lives to some extent. And so what is it, what signs suggest? Because I think all of us at one point or another have questioned, do we have ADHD? So kind of what signs would to you suggest kind of somebody needs a formal ADHD evaluation versus say they just need to work on their skills or their structure?
Sure. The first thing I would say is when in doubt, it's always good to talk to a professional. At minimum, just, contacting someone and, explaining, here's what's going on. Do you think I need evaluation based on this? Because you don't want to sort of just say to yourself, oh, let me take a guess and decide if I get the evaluation or not. because, a professional is going to be able to give you that insight even before you do the evaluation if they think it makes sense. But in general, like things I would say that are important to really look for are you having trouble with things on a consistent basis? Is it, if it's some small period of time and otherwise things are fine and they've been fine for a long time, certainly it could be a sign of something. But, ADHD, technically the symptoms are supposed to have sort of been there since childhood. So some people can compensate very well and just don't notice it as much in childhood or it's never picked up on. But the point is, if you're in your 40s, 50s, and suddenly you're having these issues that you never had before, I mean, in theory, it could be undiagnosed ADHD, but there's obviously lots of other things it could be as well. So you always want to just look at, are these long-term issues you've sort of dealt with and compensated, or are they sort of new?
Hmm. And often now there's traits that are like, if you feel like you're lazy or undisciplined, those can often be associated with ADHD. But of course you can have them or feel that way even without it. But I'm sure people come to you where they have this internal sense of self, where they lack the self-esteem. They feel like they can just never get anything done. They're constantly procrastinating. And you can see that they're internally labeling themselves as this lazy person. How do you go about helping them to reframe their narrative?
Hmm. Well, and that's a good question. I think some of it is trying to understand the psychological piece of it, of how do the whether you call it ADHD or just the symptoms of inattention, trouble getting stuff done, executive function challenges, how do they manifest as part, or how they become part of someone's personality? Because I think that's just a crucial thing, is that you have to understand that it's not just about the functional aspect, but it impacts someone's sense of self and who they are as a person, and it can certainly weigh on someone after a while. Like, especially if you've had all these repeated challenges of, not doing well with things because of these issues. And so by unpacking that, through therapy, that's a really good starting point to then figure out how do you make it better? Because there's obviously lots of practical strategies you can do, but you also have to address the psychological piece as well. It's not just about, simple strategies like calendar or task list or writing stuff down. You have to also address the psychological piece too.
Right. And on the aspect of ADHD, I think a lot of people look at, say, ADHD, especially ADHD medication, which is somewhat debated amongst culture. I know that we have science and neuroscience that says that those with ADHD have low dopamine levels, and that it increases that, so that it increases their motivation, their ability to follow through on tasks. I'm curious, in your experience. I know that you're not somebody who prescribes medication. But what kind of percentage of people would you say who have a formal diagnosis do you find that they need ADHD medication as a means of survival for the rest of their lives? Or do you find that maybe they start and then maybe they're able to find other ways to kind of compensate for that executive dysfunction and then live without that medication?
Sure. I mean, I think it really depends on the person. I think there's some people, and it also depends where someone is in life. If, for example, if someone has a real hard time with school, and they're able to, and sort of, maybe they need medication through school, and then, because you usually get more choices to some degree in a job once you're done with school. And so if you pick a job that really fits well with ADHD symptoms, it may be that you don't necessarily, you're able to function well because you're enjoying what you're doing, and, the tasks don't really sort of fit into things that are especially challenging and keep you interested. So it may be that you can function okay without medication. So there's that part of it. There's also people do develop, various coping strategies to be able to compensate. And for some people, they can certainly go off medication. For others, it really is sort of a long-term thing. But again, it really depends. I think the idea is it's always good to look at all the different sort of treatment options, and and it's often a combination of things. Like, 'cause even if you do medication, it's not going to magically give you the executive function skills to be organized. It may make it easier to use strategies, but you still have to have the strategies.
Right, right. Yeah. And I think that's something that often people miss, is that they think, oh, I'm just going to take this medication. It's going to solve all of these problems. And it doesn't necessarily do any of that. It can be a tool, but you have to know how to use it in the right context. And I think that's where we go into lots of different modalities and methodologies, part of what we're here to discuss. I know that some aspects of like a ADHD or just somebody who has executive dysfunction might be even time blindness, where they forget time, or that they're not able to set clear deadlines. So I know maybe they could set a timer or set blocks of time. Do you have any like kind of general strategies that you can kind of think of, and specifically about helping us to overcome our time management, just to start with?
Sure. I mean, I think you've already touched on, the idea of some of it is that basically you want to figure out where are the challenges. So if you're someone that sort of zones out and just loses track of time, having a timer or something that kind of gets your attention at different time intervals can be a good starting point because then you're less likely to miss meetings or other things if I can focus on whatever I need to do because I know this alarm is going to pop up and remind me to stop whatever I'm doing to go to the next thing. So that's part of it. Planning stuff out can be really important because it creates a time anchor. Because especially if you have a job where you could have 4 or 5 hours at a time where you're just working on tasks and there's no meetings or anything to attend, it's very easy to sort of not work as efficiently and get sidetracked. So having like actual like meetings or a plan of where you're going to work on at each point during the day can definitely help keep someone sort of better organized. In terms of like making estimations, like over time, learning how to make good estimations for how long things take can be very helpful. And one of the best ways to actually do that is to actually track your time. Like, for example, there's a program called Toggle where you can basically type in a task, hit the start and stop button, and then basically you can then look at your schedule and it shows you, each task you did and how long it took. Because if you do the same types of tasks over and over again, they're probably going to take roughly the same amount of time. So if you know how long they take and you've actually tracked it, you can then use that to more effectively plan time estimations. There's also a program called Goblin Tools where basically uses along the lines of AI, where basically you can put in like a general task and it'll break it down into parts for you. And it'll give you like general estimates of how long each part should take. Obviously, it's very general because it's, not catered to your individual needs, but it creates a really good starting point to figure out for certain, like you could put in cleaning your room, cleaning the kitchen, I don't know, packing for a trip, like whatever it is. There's, you can sort of create, if it's general enough, you can put it in and it'll break down different steps. And there's a cool thing where it has a certain number of peppers on it that dictate how detail oriented it is as far as breaking it down. I mean, you can break down almost the most minute thing to begin with into even more minute steps.
Hmm.
So it's definitely an interesting tool. It can definitely be helpful for a lot of people.
I also love the idea of body doubling because that tends to lower the amount of energy it takes to start something. Since most of the procrastination, most of the barrier that we encounter when trying to do something, especially something that we don't want to do, is going to be up front. And once you're able to spend maybe just 10, 15 minutes on something, you start to get into a flow and you find that it's actually easier than you thought it would be. And one of the apps that I love is focusmate.com. There's also an alternative called Cave Day. And so these are sessions where you can schedule a remote session with somebody around the world and you just kind of share your video and you just like work quietly on whatever you're doing. And I find it is amazing, especially if you're somebody who works at home. And so there's a range of tools that you can help with this kind of issues about focusing or prioritizing. And so I want to get into that. And I'd love if you could walk us through kind of what does a clean setup that can help somebody turn kind of chaos into kind of some kind of singular form of productivity. I guess looking at it from like how do you kind of capture information? How do you triage? How would you use a calendar or task list? So kind of give me the whole shebang.
All right. Yeah. And I think when it comes down to it, yeah, I mean, I would say that like the number one rule for all of this is write stuff down. Don't try to rely too much on your memory. Because the problem is even if you have a good memory, it gets very cluttered if you're trying to keep track of so many things, and you may not remember everything you do right in that moment. So the idea is to like visually see everything in front of you, whether it's a task or an event. Just the first rule is really write everything down. As far as how to approach it, my strong suggestion would be, things you need to do go into a task list, and actual events go into a calendar. Because here's something to think about. So let's say you add all of your tasks to the calendar. It may be great. You may get an alarm that pops up at a certain time to do it. But what happens if you don't pay attention to your phone or your computer and you miss that task? And let's say the next day pops up. Unless you go back and look at your calendar from the prior day, you're never going to see that task again. But if it's on a task list, it's going to keep popping up as overdue, so you're going to continue to see it until you do something with it. And also, if you're planning out tasks, by seeing it in a task list, you can actually see everything, like all your tasks together, how they connect up, if it's like breaking a bigger task into parts of subtasks. But if they're scheduled just in a calendar by day, you're not going to see the whole picture together. But, in addition to that, obviously just because tasks are on a list doesn't mean they're going to get done. So my suggestion would be put tasks in a task list, assign a set day and time to those tasks, but make it realistic. Don't just put a bunch of tasks in it and assign a random day and time. Look at your calendar. So use the calendar for actual events. Look at when you're actually free to do these tasks, and then assign time to each task in the task list. And what you could do is either block out time for like bigger tasks in the calendar as well, so it holds that time, or put like a category. So, for example, I don't know, admin time, paying bills, and then you could have it itemized in the task list at the same time of, these are the specific bills I need to pay. But the point is that you need both a calendar and task list to really plan effectively, because you're not going to know what you need to do if you just look at your events, and you're not going to know when you have time to do the tasks if you just look at your task list.
Right, right. I know another great tool I love is Sensama, although it's like $20 a month or so, but it kind of combines this idea of a calendar and a task list. Because I think if you just have a task list, that it can be very overwhelming, and you might end up just putting all your tasks in there, but then you never know where to start. And if you're somebody who has this kind of executive dysfunction, you don't have the ability to assign that kind of emotional salience to know kind of what is the most important thing you should be doing on. And if you do pick something, you might kind of second guess yourself, something I've experienced where I just don't even know if what I'm working on right now is the most important thing. So on one hand, you might have your task list, but then on the other hand, there's an important aspect of having a calendar, because there is this idea and aspect of time blocking, right? And that's become very popular recently. And I think there's a lot of advocates who really advocate for time blocking, where you can have a task list, but they advocate that you should pull those tasks into your calendar and kind of plan your whole day so that you know exactly what you're working on. The problem for me when I've tried that is that part of the day might come up. Maybe I'm like low energy and I just don't feel like doing that thing that I had scheduled for myself. And so then I feel like the whole system kind of comes crashing down, because I can never really feel like I can actually follow through if I try to plan out my whole day. I'm wondering kind of what thoughts you have around this.
Sure, absolutely. And just one other thing, yeah, I think Susama is a great program. And one thing that's great about it also is it teaches people how to plan for themselves. So, I work with some people where they'll use some long term, but others will use it, for a few weeks to just train themselves. Then you can sort of do a lot of the same stuff with dragging and dropping the tasks, with other programs, out that don't have all the planning prompts when you learn to do it yourself. But to answer your question about like what do you do when you plan stuff out, the biggest thing is you have to have flexibility in a plan. The problem, and this is where I see this a lot, where a lot of people think, oh, I can never plan effectively because something's going to come up. I'm not going to feel like doing this. And then my whole plan's shot. So why bother planning? So the idea is the plan really should be a good structure for what you want to do and need to do, with the idea that you have to have flexibility built in. There are going to be times where things take longer than you think. There are going to be times you get tired, things interrupt you. So the idea is to basically have your plan, but also continually adjust it as you go. So let's say, low energy, you don't feel like doing something. If it's not something that's time sensitive and it doesn't really matter if you're actually doing that day or not, make an actual plan. Look at, what do you feel like doing in that moment that you could get done, and then put that task in that time, and then schedule that other task you couldn't get done to a different time that's likely to work, where you think you are likely to feel in the mode, and other factors are work to be able to get done then.
Mm-hmm.
Like it's sort of like the idea of like, if you think about like an electronic calendar, the idea of like dragging and dropping tasks. You can sort of move them around. The idea is they ultimately have to get done at some point. But when they're not, are not time sensitive, if there's an intentionality to actually moving them, that can be important. The thing is not to just randomly say, oh, I don't feel like doing this today, I'll just move it tomorrow. Because if you keep doing that without any really thought of when could I actually get it done, then you can keep pushing tasks off for a very long time.
Right, right. And then sometimes I know different to do programs. I know right now I'm using one called TickTick. I like how it has a lot of functionality built into it, where I can actually create a timer, so I can log my time, or I can do a Pomodoro and do a countdown on a specific task if I'm not really feeling it. It also has habit tracking, but it can be also overwhelming. But then on one hand, one thing I don't like is that you can set a due date for a task, but then say if I'm planning out my entire week, it might be able to set a random date in the future of like, okay, I'll just do this quick thing on this date. And that date comes and maybe I don't end up doing it. So then you lose trust with your system. And then it makes it kind of intermixed, because you might end up having like a project or a report, and you absolutely have to get it done on Friday. And so if you're setting random due dates for tasks intermixed with actual things that need to get done on a specific date, it can be hard to kind of trust that kind of system. And I know, like, say, Todoist is a separate program that you can actually set a start date and a due date. So in that case, you can still get tasks to show up in your Today tab if you have a start date, but then it's going to list differently dates that actually have a due date, so that you're able to kind of see that difference. But then I get stuck in this idea of I like this term called shiny new toy syndrome, because I'm constantly looking at these different apps and I see, ooh, this has a due date and a start date functionality. Oh, this will solve that problem. And then I move all my tasks over to this problem, or to this new solution, and I still have some of the same dysfunction that I was having previously. So I think it's clear that it's not just myself, it's a habit that a lot of us, I think, get stuck in, where we see something new and shiny and we think, oh, this new program is going to solve our problems. And at the end of the day, it doesn't. So I'm just curious, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the experience that you're sharing, I think is certainly quite common. I see that a lot in the idea that, first of all, when you're picking a task list to use, you don't want to just pick one because, oh, someone says it's good or it looks good. You want to take a step back first and think about, what are your actual needs for the task list? Do you like color coding? Do you need subtasks? Do you need one that has a start and an end time? Like, to look at, like, what are the different things that you actually want and need in a program, and then from there search and see which program may make sense. So I think that's a starting point. In some cases, you can sort of test out a program a little bit before you sort of go all in on it, just to get a feel for the functionality. Some programs you can transfer the tasks fairly easily. Like, some of them, if they connect them to the Reminders app, you can import the Reminders app into a couple different taskless apps. But the other thing also is, sometimes starting over has its benefits too, because it forces you to really look at what tasks you actually need and which ones are overdue, or really don't even make sense to have in there in the first place. So you just keep passing along. But one thing is, just to go back to that you mentioned around TickTick. And again, I think TickTick's a great program. It's one I use quite a bit with clients, and I use myself a little bit for certain things. But one thing that can be very helpful and to figure out so my strong recommendation is, when you have tasks that have actual due dates, put the actual due date in the task list. Don't put in a different sort of due date for the actual task. But what you can do to avoid confusion around the actual date versus when you can work on it is use the actual task for the real due date. Create a subtask with an interim due date for yourself. Because then, basically, if the subtasks have your own due dates and the regular tasks have actual due dates, then that's an easier way to differentiate what's a real due date versus what's your own. Basically, like, I would set the due date for a subtask as the time you're going to work on it.
Uh, that's certainly, I agree, that's one strategy, where you'll see the tasks show up sooner, and you give your time ahead of time to see, trying to accomplish, say, small parts of that task, since you often don't want to assume, because the other issue is that sometimes we'll insert an item into our to-do list that's like, finish this project, and it's like a 20-hour project, right? And you're putting that next to take the dog to the vet, and there's two completely separate tasks that have two way different time commitments. And I think we often don't take the time to use a system like, there's SMART, which is like specific, measurable, accurate, et cetera, that allows us to kind of set guidelines in terms of how are we creating this task. Because other things that come up, like, say, we procrastinate on something, and there's a myriad of reasons why we might procrastinate on something. One of them being, we haven't clearly defined the task, haven't defined how are we going to measure our progress against that task. And we don't break things down into smaller bits. And so what thoughts do you have on that? Kind of like, what kind of guidelines do you give about helping to minimize this, the cognitive dissonance associated with doing, say, large tasks and little small things?
Sure. So, I mean, I think your point about breaking it down to very concrete steps and, like, having a very concrete task is important, because you're right. If you just say finished project, that's very open ended. But even if someone in their mind sort of has a sense of, oh, this is what I should do during that time, like when they plan out, they may not necessarily feel that same way when they actually go to do it. But if the task or subtask is very actionable and it's very clear, I don't know, write the introduction to this project, then it's going to be easier for someone to act on it, because they don't have to think as much in the moment of, what do I actually do? It's laid out more in front of them, right there for them.
Right. And I think another thing that I've found really helpful is, I'll have like a running chat conversation with ChatGPT. And some of these programs now, I know Todoist is actually working on a beta version where they're integrating AI into the program. And with TickTick, I actually have an agent, like an API connected, or what is it called? An MCP. I have an MCP server between TickTick and Claude, so that I'm able to speak to AI and it's able to grab all my task lists over and actually have like a two-way sync. So I'm also able to make changes to it. But one thing I find helpful is that, say you have this big project and you can just tell an AI, hey, I have this big project. This is the project. Can you help me break it down into smaller bits? And of course, it does an amazing job at helping you to say, here are the subtasks that you should create. And if it's due by this date, here are the times that you should set. So here are the due dates of these subtasks that you should be setting. And so I think there's through the power of AI and the magic of AI, of course, is that we can help to organize ourselves. And I think it's an amazing tool for somebody with any level of executive dysfunction. That the closer and the more often you are able to use AI to kind of be that mental assistant to your clutter, you're going to just excel in so many more ways than I think you thought previously were possible.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think with AI, I think there's a lot you can do with it. And again, I think some of it is either knowing what program to pick or what prompts to use. Because certainly, I mean, any AI program, if you have the right prompts, it'll break stuff down for you. There's some that are definitely a little more focused on on this. Like there was one actually I'd created called ADHD Assist that basically it focuses. Its like main focus is actually on basically planning out tasks. Just because I found that sometimes if people don't really have a good sense of the prompts to start, it's harder to, and then they spend a lot of time fiddling with it rather than actually doing a quick plan to get the stuff done.
Yeah. And then there's something else I just recently did. There's a guy that built out a really solid prompt, and he has it freely available. And his website is buildyouraicoach.com, and it's a really amazing kind of prompt that also prompts you to answer questions like answering what are your values, what are signs of burnout, what are the main focus areas that you really aspire to accomplish, who are the people that you rely on, and it really helps you to collect all of this information, and has this really this prompt that's kind of this warming and caring AI coach that you can just use in a running chat conversation on Claude or ChatGPT or Gemini. And it's able to kind of help you prioritize and tell you what should you be focusing on based on the values and all the things going on around in your life. So I found that absolutely 100% free to be helpful in my life. I'm wondering, how have you been able to use AI with yourself or with your clients to kind of help them navigate this?
Sure. I mean, use it in a couple different ways. I mean, again, it depends what the needs are. I think certainly for planning out tasks, using, basically like ChatGPT or the program I'd created, works well for like planning out tasks or for students, homework assignments, just to sort of create a simple plan of here's what I'm going to do when, because it basically prompts you to, if you just put in the task, because then asks you, how long are they going to take? What time do you available? Because it basically then answer, if you don't put all the stuff in to start, it asks for these information. So it trains you to think, oh, I actually need to figure out this stuff for myself. So over time you can learn to do more of the planning yourself without even needing AI quite as much for some of that. But, it also can really save time. So you can use it to, help draft emails, or, a lot of people may spend a lot of time thinking, how should I explain what I'm trying to say? So you put in a couple sort of bullet points, and then, AI can kind of output a general email and you can make some tweaks. But so I think it can be used to sort of save time quite a bit. Sometimes if you get I'll even sometimes use with clients where if we're thinking about, what could we do to improve the evening routine? And, the person has absolutely no idea and just can't think of anything in the moment. So basically, we can put it into, an AI program and just, I do screen share and we just look at it, and then we look at all these options they give us, and then we go through and see, does this one look appealing? What about this one? Because sometimes just you can use it to get you thinking, and then obviously take it on your own from there. But just if you're not even sure where to start with some stuff, it can be really helpful.
Right. I'm wondering about routine. And so I know that everybody has different workflows, everybody has different life circumstances, whether you're in school, whether you're in a job at an office, or you're a remote contractor. But we all have routine. We're humans. We live on routine and doing things on a repeatable basis. Some of the things and the routines and habits we build aren't so great for us. And it's particularly important around our work routine, right? I know that there's common ways to help yourself focus, help get yourself into the mind space, just like how people and sports players have like a little sometimes weird or little routine that they do before they go out and play, and it helps them get into the right mindset. What kinds of routines or things do you find help your clients?
Yeah, I mean, routines can definitely be really helpful. And so I think the idea is to figure out, based on what you're trying to do, what might be a good, routine, like something sort of super simple that you can do before you get started. So maybe it's the idea, I don't know, like if you're getting sitting down in the morning to start working, that maybe you basically, have a routine of opening up your computer, looking at your calendar, looking at your task list. Maybe you spend 20 minutes responding to emails with the idea then that once the 20 minutes is over, then you get to whatever is already pre-planned out. Or, maybe you go for a walk in the morning before you start working, and kind of have the morning routine of, getting up, maybe have a cup of coffee, work out, go for a walk. But like, whatever works for each person, just having that same routine often helps get people moving.
Right. And I also know, I mean, Huberman even said even having your phone in the room when you're working has has a noticeable impact from a scientific measurement standpoint, that it can actually impair your ability to focus. Knowing even your phone is in the room, even if it's folded upside down or away from you. So there's things like that that can obviously impair motivation, and then even notifications. I think that we have this age where there's this hustle culture, and there's this aspect of being busy, and especially I think with COVID, after everybody started to work from home, they didn't go to the office, so they had to kind of appear, like, at least show that they were working, because your boss might think that you're not working. And so it's constantly checking email, it's constantly looking at Slack or other messaging programs and responding to people quickly. But that kind of takes you out of that deep flow, that deep connection, to be able to really like focus on whatever it is you're trying to work on. And they've even shown that a notification or singing up, sending a message, that it takes on average about 20 minutes to really fully focus back onto the subject that you were trying to focus on. So, what thoughts do you have around communication, messaging, and how to balance that out with actually accomplishing stuff?
I mean, it is a really good point that you've brought up, and definitely can be a huge source of distraction, because it's not just the actual time you're spending looking and responding, but mentally to get back into whatever you're doing before. I mean, obviously it depends on your job and what the requirements are, but I would say basically when you can, maybe you check email and then you take 20 or 30 minutes or more. You basically close out the email program, any other messaging programs, focus on whatever like the main task is, and then take a break and go back to email and Slack and everything else, because the constant in and out definitely makes it hard to focus. And you're also probably not going to be quite as productive in whatever the main task is anyway. Because
Right.
even if you look at something, like let's say you look at email and don't respond right away, it's still in your head. You're still like, part of your mind is still thinking about, oh, I just saw that email from so and so. I need to think about what am I going to say back. And so that's going through your head while you're trying to focus on whatever the main task is in front of you. So basically, think about it like if you've ever sort of worked on like a holiday when there's like very little email, other things, people are supposed to not constantly contacting you, and think about how that may feel in terms of, or like, I don't know, it's a random day in the summer if it's super light. But the idea of like thinking about what it feels like that. Imagine if you could kind of create that feeling like on other days normally.
Yeah, I think one last thing on this subject is one method that I think. So I've previously interviewed David Allen on this podcast, of course, who was very famous with his getting things done, the GTD system, and having ways to pull out tasks on your head and writing them down. And then more importantly, I think he kind of popularized the idea of like a weekly review, right? Where you're able to go through your inbox, you should clear your inbox, you should tidy your desk, you should choose the top three things or so things that you're going to work on in the next week. What kinds of process or recommendations do you give in terms of how to go and regularly review the things that you're working on? Because if you don't, then I think you're just kind of scrambling and picking day to day. Oh, what am I going to work on, right? And it's probably not going to go out as well as you had hoped.
Right. I mean, I think some of it also is the mindset. The idea that if you have like within reason, having a mindset of, I can always do better with this. So how can I improve? Because like, if something's going terribly, you're probably going to think, oh, I need to address this. But if it's going decently, you might not really like take that step back and think, how can I make things better? And so, having the ability to continually review systems that you're using to look at, is my task list system working effectively? Is my calendar working effectively? Is my online scheduling working well enough? Like, sort of looking at like, what are all these sort of systems you use, and is there room for improvement? And then from there, figuring out what makes sense to improve on. I think having like simple, and again, the hard part is you can't do everything. Like, if you say, like, thinking about this podcast, if you were trying to try to take every single strategy we've talked about today and try to implement it, you're probably going to implement very little, if anything, because it's probably too much at once to implement. So picking a couple of things as like your primary things to try to implement as a starting point is good. And again, you can do other things also, but if you have like the primary focus is I need to really ensure I work on, let's say, these three things. And there's other stuff I'll try to do if I can, but really it's the three things, because basically you get those down and then you can move on and add three new things in.
All right. So, kind of moving to task initiation and follow through, which is really arguably like the most difficult thing for somebody with any kind of executive dysfunction. I think many people know what to do and they still can't start. So, kind of what's your go-to protocol for turning this kind of intention, this desire to start into an action and kind of how to keep that momentum going?
Sure. I mean, so I think planning can be a good starting point. Obviously, a task is not going to get done because you planned it out. But if you have a clear plan of what you should be doing in the moment, that's a good starting point. And from there to look at, but also thinking about, have you planned it out effectively as far as like thinking about what is likely that I'm actually going to be willing or feel like doing this task in the moment when I've scheduled it. But aside from that, other things that can be helpful are, so with ADHD in particular, a lot of it has to do with this sense of self-stimulation, that you're not sufficiently stimulated to be able to be as focused as would be ideal on a task if it's not that interesting. But one thing you can do is you can actually add, some sort of physical movement in while you're let's say working, and basically between, like, so for example, if you have flexibility, if you work at home or in an office setting, you can have like a little desk bike, like or elliptical, like they're like this big, and you can basically pedal while you're working. Or if you have a sit stand desk, you can use a balance board, or there's this cool thing called a whirly board you can kind of balance on. But the idea is that basically by getting a little bit of movement that's sort of mindless, you can actually trick your mind into thinking you're more interested in something than you are. And so that in itself can also make it easier to get started on things that are hard to do.
Mhm.
So that,
I
that's sort
also
of, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, no, I was just adding that I also find that having a treadmill desk helps me. I know some people have different mixed results with that, but I find that getting the blood flowing is that it kind of helps me to be more focused, and I think it resonates with, say, you might go to the gym, and some people seem to spend their whole day like alternating between working out and then on their laptop at the gym. And I think there's something to that, like getting the heart pumping. It kind of helps to speed things up, and you're able to find focus easier since you have a little bit more endorphins.
Yeah, no, that's definitely true, and I appreciate you sharing that. Yeah, actually have a treadmill under my desk too. I basically often rotate throughout the day between the treadmill, a desk elliptical, and then standing with a balance board or the whirly board. I find just kind of the variability throughout the day, or also sometimes based on tasks. Like, so, for example, I'm not going to do the treadmill while I'm meeting with clients, but when I'm responding to email, or if I'm on a Zoom call where I don't have to be that active, I'll sometimes do the treadmill. But then pedaling is very discreet, so I can do that during almost anything else that I'm doing. Or, depending on what I'm doing, I can also stand up on the balance board. So it's nice to just have that variety of physical movement throughout the day.
Mhm. And I think it's important to remember, which is really the hardest thing sometimes, is that action precedes motivation, right? That you're never really going to feel motivated to do something that perhaps you don't really want to do. And often the things we need to do are things that we don't really want to do. And I heard this interesting thing from a friend that's in relation to the sober mind and drugs, is that I think drugs, say even ADHD drugs, they tend to make it easier to start the thing, but in some cases they can make it difficult to kind of stay focused on that thing. And when you're not doing any, you're not using any kind of exogenous substance to help yourself try to work. It's kind of the opposite, where you end up having, it's harder to get yourself to start the thing, but then it can be easier to maintain a sense of flow and focused work on that task. But often the most difficult part is just getting started. So, what kind of recommendations do you have for people who are really just dreading something entirely and they just don't want to do it so bad? But we often have, everybody shares this experience where you absolutely hate the idea of doing something. You do it, and then say it literally took you 2 minutes, and you were procrastinating on it for weeks. So, what thoughts do you have on that?
So there are a couple of things. One, I mean, the point you made about how people often after think, oh, this wasn't so bad, it's just super fast. Sometimes, like, especially if you're someone that constantly thinks about a task, oh, I don't want to do this. Like, think about I mean, even just sometimes reminding yourself of the fact that, that the second, if I actually, so if I start doing it, I don't have to keep thinking about it because otherwise it's going to annoy me. I'm going to keep thinking about it. Imagine like all the time and mental energy that goes into thinking about dreading this task versus just getting it done and that sense of satisfaction when it's done. So for some people that can be I mean, it's sort of a little out there, but something I've on occasion suggested to clients is the idea of, especially ones that I'm staying up super late doing work and then regret it. Video record yourself at the end of the night when you've regretted how late you've stayed up and how bad you feel. And then earlier in the day, when you're starting to think, oh, I'll push this off to later, play back that recording. And it's kind of your future self reminding you of what it's like, when you regretted what you were doing. And for some people, that can create an extra motivation to start earlier or to do the tasks. They don't have to sort of have that negative experience later.
Right. I also find two other kind of helpful habits. When it comes to writing, there's, it really like it's hard to run into somebody who ever says, like, really no writer ever says that they enjoy the process of writing. They enjoy the process of having written. And often in the past, when I would go and try to write something, I would just feel like, oh, I don't want to write this. But then that's on top of this feeling of, oh, it needs to be really good. It needs to be perfect, right? And there's that aspect of perfectionism. And so one of the habits that I was able to use to help myself get get this process started, was by telling myself just to write whatever comes out of my head and to do no editing. Don't backspace even if I make typos and stuff, just to kind of brain dump in a way, and to just say to myself ahead of time that I'm not going to use this. Just kind of put that out there, and that really lowers this internal guard about making something perfect, because it's just getting started, right? And even if it turns out to be a pile of crap, more often than not, just being able to spend a few minutes getting started something, there's going to be a little idea that pops up. Ooh, that's interesting. And then you go down this path, and then you go down that path. And that's really where that kind of that reoccurring, that motivation kind of can spark from. Do you have any additional methods or thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think the idea of just being able to stop, to stop working or to stop having to focus on, oh, I just need to get this done, and the idea of getting ready to say, I'm just gonna set a timer and start and see what pops up. So the idea of like basically, because some people's like part of their hesitancy in getting started, let's say on the writing task, as an example you mentioned, is that they feel like, oh, I'm not going to organize this well enough, or it's not going to be perfect. But the idea of just saying, I'm going to set a time for 10 minutes, and I'm going to write whatever comes to mind, regardless of how ridiculous it may sound. You basically use that time and kind of gets things flowing a lot more, and then you can go back and reorganize it later.
Right. Yeah, and I think having that timer, that countdown timer, that can give yourself some kind of relief, because not only is it, like, say, breaking up something into a smaller thing, but say even if the idea of setting a 10-minute timer seems too daunting, then, well, set it to 8 minutes or set it to 5 minutes. And I think the key is to not allow yourself to do anything else. That is really the key in my opinion, that you can set a timer for as little as you feel like you have to, and just to get started. Does 5 minutes of working on this task feel doable? And you don't have to force yourself to do the work. But the only alternative is, for that 5 minutes, you can't do anything else. And I've literally found that strategy to be one of the most helpful things if I'm just feeling completely low energy. I just don't feel like doing the thing, is just setting a timer and knowing that after that timer's over, I can do whatever else I want afterwards. But for that timer countdown, I can't do anything else. So I don't have to write. I don't have to respond to this thing, but I'm just going to sit here and stare at my screen. And more often than not, just like the studies where they put people in a room where they couldn't do anything, but they could shock themselves, and most people choose to shock themselves if they don't have anything else to do because they're bored. That's how painful boredom is. That more often than not, you're going to get yourself started on that task ahead of you.
Yeah, I mean, I think the idea, and again, with boredom, I think it also comes down to if someone, if their mind wanders and they can entertain themselves with whatever's going on in their mind. Some people are going to get lost in their own daydreaming, whereas others are going to be so bored that they're going to, want some sort of stimulation that externally if they can't do it internally.
Right, right. And so another aspect of focus and task completion is kind of having emotional regulation. And so sometimes our nervous system kind of runs hot. Maybe the plan that we created kind of falls apart. So, do you have any kind of like rapid downshift or way that people can kind of regulate themselves so that they can kind of pick up like the next step with a clear head?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a couple of things. So one would be, doing like a simple like meditation or mindfulness activity, using like the Calm or Headspace app. Just doing like a quick like 2 or 3 minute, or whether it's an actual meditation or deep breathing, something that's a signal I'm going to do this. I recognize myself like getting revved up or getting anxious or getting stressed, and I'm going to take this opportunity to do a mental reset. So, the deep breathing or meditation can be really good. Saying I'm going to take a quick walk around the block or around the office parking lot and then come back. Just, something like where it's a very planned, planned break, being intentional with what you're doing. Or maybe I'm going to close my eyes for a minute and set a timer and play calming music or use an eye like a heated eye mask, like for a couple minutes. Like figure out like what is your sort of reset? What could you do to reset, but have like a clear plan of this is what I'm going to do. And then I'm going to get back to whatever I was doing.
Yeah, I think that's an important thing that's not often talked about because doing any kind of work is can be stressful, right? And that stress has a tendency to build up until you feel symptoms of burnout. And burnout is a place nobody wants to be in, yet with society and culture the way it has been, it's been increasing in levels that we haven't seen for centuries, honestly. And so being able to understand whether something is stressing you out and being able to choose to focus, even if you have to view it from like this productive mindset of which is also it's a whole nother rabbit hole, and even though it's not necessarily healthy, even if if you're resting, but you might justify resting because it's going to help you be more productive. But even if that's the case, being able to recognize that you're kind of feeling a little bit anxious to be able to walk away for a sec, to go take a walk. Or things I like to do is I like to do Wim Hof breathing sometimes, or I might do box breathing if I want to calm my nervous system down. And so being able to find strategies that work for you that allow you to separate yourself from the work, kind of create natural divides between different parts of the day so that you're not carrying that stress with you for the rest of the day are incredibly important and really things that aren't often talked about. So being able to find the thing that works for you, super, super important. Um, on that note, I think another aspect that's kind of not really looked at is kind of having like a wind down routine. I know a famous author. He would I'm just forgetting his name, but he would have this line that he says at the end of his workday is like something like "work shutdown complete," where he says this weird phrase out loud as a means of telling his brain, okay, the work part of the day is over. I'm going to focus on my family. I'm going to focus on winding down. So having that kind of routine, even if you're somebody who works from home, I think is also important. So any advice that you might give to people who especially work from home or students working at home as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think trying to create as much of a boundary as you can. So whether it's if you have the luxury of having enough space to kind of have a workspace and just doing work there, and the idea is when you're sitting there, you're doing work, but when you're not, you're sort of in your personal life. That can be one way of doing it. Having set work times, and again, it may not always be I'm done with work for the day and I'm going to take the rest of the day off, but people do differently. Some people say I'm going to take a break and spend I don't know 5 to 8 with my family, and then I'm going to go back and respond to emails for 30 minutes and dig out from the evening. But haven't gotten that time with family. So there's different ways to do it. It doesn't have to all be the entire workday all at once, and then your personal time. Like people, you can space it out sometimes too. Based on your job and what makes sense.
And also screens are a huge distraction. We often use our phones as a means as like a numbing tool, right? So we might be stressed from something from work and you would instinctively grab your phone and start like just flipping through videos and social media and you find that you don't really give yourself a proper break. You're just kind of using your phone for that quick dopamine hit. And the unfortunate thing is when you do that, when you get that cheap dopamine, you're actually wrecking your own dopamine system and it actually makes work harder. So it actually makes it more difficult for you to find any intrinsic interest in the work that actually is meaningful. So I think it's important to be able to regulate yourself on that front, which I think is frankly a losing battle, especially with Gen Z nowadays. So what kind of screen habits that you like advice do you give to people? Any kind of apps or methods that you recommend?
Yeah. I mean, I think sort of, it depends. If sort of people have a real hard time putting down the phone and are constantly on apps, you can certainly set, you can use, if you have the ability to, set, screen time limits or at least recognition of it, if you have an iPhone, for example. Or there's an app called Freedom that's really good where you can basically schedule downtime from certain websites on the computer or certain apps on your phone. And so basically it gives you time where you can't really access certain ones. So and especially if you set it automatically, then, that's a good time, like, for example, of preventing yourself from playing on certain apps when you should be going to bed.
I've never actually met anybody who has downloaded Freedom who actually uses it. It seems to be one of those tools that if you set a block, if you block, okay, no internet now, that seems to be one of the most difficult thing for people to contend with is having something that actually blocks your internet or blocks those apps that you find comforting. And at one point during something that might be super stressful, you're just going to uninstall it or you're just not going to use it. Personally, I found something that is a little bit less of a block to be useful. There's like a free app called Jomo, Jomo. And so something that works for me is that I'm able to set a limit so that before I open up that social media app, I actually have to open up Jomo and it has a countdown. And the first countdown is just a 5-second countdown, and I can unlock it for up to 15 minutes. The second time I go to unlock it, it's going to be a 15-second countdown, and then it's going to be a 30-second countdown. So the actual countdown builds as, the more times in the day that I actually use it. But that countdown gives me the opportunity to decide in that moment, what am I trying to use this app for? Is it just to feel, am I stressed? Do I really need to use it right now? Am I just popping it up out of habit, while in the grocery line? And then I'm able to put it away and decide, you know what? I don't actually need it. But knowing that if I just wait those few more seconds is enough for me to keep the app enabled and for me to not uninstall it. And so I think having something like that where you're not creating this 100% barrier, that you're still able to access it, but you're just, it's like putting the cookies on the upper cabinet where you have to go grab the stool, right? You're putting barriers between you and this bad thing. And for me, I found that to be a very helpful method.
Yeah, no, I think that sounds good. And again, I think everyone's different. So it's always good to, for everyone listening out there to remember that, no two people are exactly alike. So there's a variety of strategies you can try, but you have to figure out what works for you. What may work for one person isn't necessarily going to work for you, or vice versa. So it's important to sort of figure out your own individual comprehensive system that will work for you.
Mhm. And when we're not using apps to distract ourselves, I think the important underlooked aspect of any level of consistent productivity and mental well-being is rest, right? But rest can also feel guilty, right? We might feel like we're resting too much if we're in a school or you're in a round of incubators with other startup founders. We've kind of had this culture of hustle and you have to work hard and just work until you're dead. And so, how do you kind of coach this mindset, and what methods or suggestions do you have for somebody to help them not only reframe rest, but to actually have true rest?
Well, I think some of it is, first of all, finding activities you like to do outside of work that are meaningful to you. Because obviously there are periods of time where you truly want to like physically rest and not do a huge amount. But also sometimes when you find, hobbies or activities that aren't work related, that are fun, that, you feel sort of motivated to do, that creates certainly different stuff in your brain, but it can sort of be very motivating to do it. And so finding those kinds of activities also then become a draw away from work to have more time to really rest in a sense. For some people, it's something as simple as, doing Sudoku or crossword puzzles. Or for others, it may be, working out or, going for a walk. But sort of finding those activities for you that you find sort of meaningful and helpful, and those can be a big draw away from from sort of working too much or from other distractions.
Yeah, and they've actually measured rest in the brain with EEG machines. And I loosely recall that the aspect of, say, watching Netflix it has approximately it adds about 20 minutes of rest. So once you go past 20 minutes of Netflix, the rest that you get from that kind of just drops off a cliff. And yet they've shown that there's a difference between this kind of rest that is like on the couch watching TV and this kind of active recovery rest where maybe you're going out, you're playing a game of pickleball with friends, right? Or you have some meetup group that you go to later on. And so in these cases, it might actually use energy, right? We don't typically think of these things as rest, but they have actually scientifically shown that these kinds of things kind of recuperate us way more than just sitting on the couch, just kind of mindlessly looking at some kind of content. So I think to your point, having some method of recuperation that is outside of work is a super important thing for us all to consider.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Another thing that is pretty common nowadays is urge surfing, right? Where we kind of crave for distraction. We kind of go into this mindless loop of you're just stuck on TikTok, right? I'm sure you have a lot of clients who do that. Um, and that probably affects sleep as well. What kind of recommendations, suggestions do you give to clients around making sure that they're kind of regulating their own urges and moderating that, and also balancing out and having important, good sleep?
Sure. So, I mean, one thing that can be very helpful is to sort of try to get yourself in the habit of setting a timer before you even go on to one of the apps, like TikTok or Instagram. I mean, some of them have, they don't advertise very much. If you go into the settings, some of them have sort of things, which I think they may be required to by law, where you can actually, in the settings, set a timer where it pops up after you've been on it for a certain period of time. It's funny because I remember when the thing first came out, I think I was playing around with it with Instagram, and I think I set it for 5 minutes. And then I don't know, at some point I got some alert saying that they've done away with the 5 minute option. And I think I had to have like the minimum was like 20 or something higher than five. But anyway, the point is that you can either do it through the app itself or like through like the alarm clock app or another one. But the idea is, and or even like put the like Instagram or TikTok app, in a folder with next to the timer. So the idea is when you go to find the app, the timer's right there. And so if you set the timer before you start, or like the an alarm, it gets your attention. So because the problem with those apps, a lot of times you can't see the time, so you sort of lose track of things. But sort of getting the alarm, it gets you, especially something you have to really turn off. It gets you to look. Oh wait, I've actually been on this for 20 minutes. I should probably go do something else now.
And so you work with kids, parents, adults. Are there any systems or philosophies that kind of translate across all of these settings that can help support a kind of wholesome focus instead of kind of consistently having to fight it?
Yeah, I mean, I think the general thing is to sort of plan things out and write them down. Whether you're talking about like a daily schedule, like after school activities, social plans, like, have them written in some way where you can see them easily and not relying on your memory. That's probably like the number one sort of universal rule is to sort of have stuff written down so you don't have to rely on your memory, and then it helps with planning. I think it's also good to kind of preview, your day or week ahead and look at things because you also catch stuff if there's conflicts or you have to figure out logistical things. When you look at it a few days out, it's much easier to figure that out than suddenly 5 minutes before you're supposed to leave and realize you have to be in two places at once.
Right. And are there any kind of apps that you find that are most helpful, whether it's tools? I know one tool that I used to use is like be like a little square, and then you could and each face of that square has a number, and you can set it on the table, and then it does a countdown, and then you'll hear a loud beep, and so it's like a pomodoro, like a physical pomodoro countdown method. And so I know that there's physical devices, and I know that you've already mentioned apps that you like to use. So kind of what general recommendation would you have, whether it's say somebody who's raising kids or just somebody living with ADHD? That would be the kind of the easiest, lowest friction methods for them to start implementing as a structure for their routine.
Sure. I mean, I would look at apps and programs and devices that you either already have or easy to set up. So, for example, if you have an Amazon Echo at home, that could be a good starting point for some things. For basic reminders. When you're as long as there's set times you like to be within earshot of the device. for kids, even using Google Calendar, especially because, for most kids, of probably even, first, second grade, they often have, at least some access to a Chromebook. So they probably have a minimum school account. So, and obviously some kids have a personal account as well at that age, but you could basically, start getting them in the habit of putting stuff into a Google Calendar and have a shared family calendar as part of that. So, or I mean, there are programs that are more elaborate, like Cozy for families, where you can put everyone's schedule in and have shopping lists and all sorts of stuff all together. But it doesn't have to be super complicated. I think you can really start with Apple Calendar, Google Calendar for a calendar, and start small with the task list. So, for example, even for if you have Apple devices, the Reminders app, or for Google stuff, Google Tasks. They're both they keep adding more features over time. But in the scheme of things, they're fairly simplistic as far as it can do the basic functions of putting in a task, saying reminders, subtasks, but it doesn't have quite all the bells and whistles of some of the other programs like Todoist or TickTick or Asana.
Yeah, and I think it's important not to get held up on any specific program, and also if you do go with one, to make a commitment that you're not going to switch for at least 6 months or so, because it's so easy to just get locked in and zoned in on trying to find a different system that's going to help you. And I know that I mentioned GTD earlier, and I know that there's another method by Tiago Forte called Para, which is projects, areas, resources, archives, which is more so a method for organizing information into folders and making it easier for you to access different information depending on whether you have house projects or just general maintenance areas of your life. Whereas GTD is more of a philosophy around how to extract tasks, how to prioritize and review tasks. Are there any other systems or methods that you commonly recommend?
Um, Not really along those lines. The problem is I think everyone's different in terms of what they need, and sometimes when people try to focus too much on sort of one specific system, they try to like fiddle. It just isn't always work so well. But so yeah, there's nothing in particular I can think of at the moment that I feel like sort of falls in along those lines.
Okay. Are there any other things that we haven't touched on that you want to leave our listeners with?
Um, Not that I can think of. I think we've been very thorough in covering things.
Oh, great. So if people are interested in learning more about what you do or reading your book, where should they go?
Sure. Probably my website, Heller Psychology Group. .com probably makes the most sense. I mean, all of the books I've written are on there. I think my podcast is probably somewhere on the website, or social media. Carey Heller Psyd for on Instagram, or Heller Psych for the practice on Instagram.
And of course, we will link to Dr. Heller's work in the description, and along with the resources on executive and organizational skills. If this is something that helped you, maybe help a friend. Find something that you could share with a friend who might need it to kind of help them with some kind of reset of their own. So thanks again for tuning in to the MindHack podcast. I'm Cody McLean, and I'll catch you in the next episode.